Hello, and welcome to Price Points. Today we're going to be talking about public housing and the challenges we are facing with the C&I grant that was given to the city. I have with us on our panel today Karen Wiles, who is the Executive Director of the Newport News Redevelopment and Housing Authority. We have Sheila McAllister, who is the Planning Department Chair or Director of Newport News. Chief Drew, of course, Chief of the Police Department of Newport News, and Dr. Lee Vreeland, who is President and CEO of Achievable Dream. We chose this topic today because we were fortunate to receive a grant, a C&I grant of $30 million a couple of years ago. We're also in the middle of transforming a section of our neighborhood in the Southeast community, and we're facing with some of the challenges with public housing that we're going to discuss with you today. So Karen, I want to start with you. If you would just talk a little bit about public housing, what's involved, and how that developed in Newport News.
Okay. In Newport News, we are one of the Virginia's first cities, and so because of that, we created a redevelopment and housing authority very early on in the late 1930s and started developing public housing primarily in the Southeast community and lower Newport News, because at that time Newport News was just, stopped at 54th Street. And also at that time, it was the custom to build fairly large properties. And when they were first built in Newport News, they were primarily workforce housing for folks who worked in the shipyard. So we've had the bulk of our public housing has been south of 39th Street because of the history of how the city created that housing authority and all of those properties that were built in the late 30s, 40s, and 50s. We have of late, over the last 10 years, demolished quite a few public housing units, all of Harbor Homes and Dickerson Courts, which was almost 600 units. And also now we're addressing Ridley because of the Choice Neighborhoods grant. So that number is reducing, and certainly that's part of our goal, that we de-densify affordable housing, because it is quite dense in the Southeast community. Okay.
Sheila, if you would talk a little bit about the C&I grant and what's being involved in that and where we are in that process.
Okay, well, we're about 3-4 years in now?
3. Wow. Yeah.
Wow. It's been a while. But basically with C&I, the way it is that it requires us to focus on an area, a public housing project, or it could have also been just a low-income, privately owned project. But we focused on Ridley because of the statistics in Ridley. And the focus is not necessarily just on housing. It's also on the people component, changing the way people currently are. If there are needs that they need, such as workforce training, education, all of that is part of the people focus. And also there's a neighborhood focus, and that is just changing the neighborhood and providing services in the neighborhood that would be found in any part of the city. So that's the focus of C&I. It's not just the housing component. And even when you come back with housing in that area, the housing is not considered public housing. It is mixed income housing. So there will be units in there to replace some of the housing that was demolished, but there will also be additional units that will entice and encourage other people to move into the community at different income levels. And that ultimately is what changes the community.
Okay, so we're transforming a community with this grant, which was initially $30 million, and adding some money to that to help with that process.
Yes, and the focus with C&I is not just on the $30 million, it's also on the partners that you bring along with you and the investors who are willing to invest in the transformation.
Okay. And Chief, if you would you compare, if you would, the crime statistics of, let's say, public housing section with the rest of the city, and any problems or differences in that? Are there any?
Sure. No, it's a great question. Anytime we look at areas where we have condensed poverty, there's a group of challenges that come along with that. And what we find a lot of times is that issues that take place that require a police response are not always from the residents who live there. It is from individuals who come from outside and try to prey on that community, whether individuals feel like the city doesn't care, the police doesn't care, we're not policed the same. So it has some unique challenges. That is also, when we see areas of condensed poverty and issues with public housing, that's usually where we do a lot of our outreach. We partner with the Boys and Girls Club here in Newport News. I will tell you that this year we just finished our year-end press conference, and the crime numbers, which we usually see in that southeast community, were lower than they were in the communities in the north. So we see some shift in some crime areas. Now I will tell you, when I got here in 2018, I got to take part in the C&I presentation, and it was really exciting to see to learn a little bit about the history of the southeast community here in Newport News and the opportunity to revitalize, right? And it's a lot more than just structures and bricks and mortar, right? It's changing a community and a mindset. So when we look at the crime numbers, what we see a lot of times in areas of public housing, there are two issues. One I would look at as blight, areas that sometimes things get run down and we don't get as calls as often as we should in other communities or neighborhoods. And I don't know if that's just a feeling that the community or police or city government doesn't care about us. So those are one challenges. The other are, we do have issues of violence, but I don't believe there's a lot of that from outside influence that comes into those communities that feel like they can take advantage of or prey on individuals that live there. So that's some of the things that we look at when we certainly use a lot of technology. When I got here, we talked about the shot spotter system, and it was a kind of a no-brainer where to put that to help that community. But I need to make sure that individuals who find themselves living in public housing, that they understand that they are just important as members of this community as anyone else in our city, and that we make sure that we treat them and give them the same services that they deserve and the same services we would give anywhere else in our community.
Thank you. And Lee, you are responsible for teaching our children in that area. Talk about some of the challenges you may have and the students and what you're experiencing in a very successful program, I might add, of Achievable Dream.
Thank you. Yeah, it really is systemic because so many of the factors that we face with our students that are living in public housing involve transportation. Parents that are working more than one job, or maybe are working shifts that second shift, third shift, so they're not home when the children are home. It's a comprehensive set of factors that impact the children. So before the children get to school, age years of 5 and above, they may not have been read to. They may not have had the same opportunities developmentally. And it's not because parents are not interested or do not care about being engaged in their child's education. It's because of the things that they're trying to do to make ends meet. If you have to work more than one job, if you are working second shift, if you have several children in the household, you just do not have the same resources to provide. Other factors that we face: absenteeism. There's a lot of asthma that is associated with public housing, making sure that the children are getting the medical intervention that they need so that they can be in school every day. Making sure that we're doing things at different times of the day. You can't always hold parent involvement sessions at 5 p.m., 6 p.m. in the evening. Are you doing it on Saturday mornings for parents who work second shift? Are you doing it on Monday morning for those who work, on weekends? Making sure that we are meeting our families with some of the fewest resources where they are versus expecting them to always meet us where we are.
Okay. Thank you for that. So we see now that we have some challenges with our crime, challenges with our education system, and the reason we want to talk about this is so that as we develop the C&I grant and go forward, we want the public to understand some of the challenges that we're having. The statistics that we have recently, they show that there are 7,024 units of housing in the Southeast community, and 2,380 of those are public or public housing. So that's almost 1/3 of the amount of residents are in public housing. Can you talk about how we got to that point and some of the challenges we're facing with the tax credits and the people who are purchasing these housing units and redeveloping and transforming them to upgrade, what the challenges they have in doing that?
Well, the 2,380 units are not all public housing. Some of those are low-income housing, tax credit housing, where the developer gets funding to assist with the renovations of a property or the development of a property, and so they aren't necessarily subsidized. The families who live there are not necessarily subsidized. Some of those also are mortgage revenue bond financed. So it's a smaller number that are actually subsidized apartments in the Southeast community. But I think the reason we got there is that, Newport News saw a lot of development in the 60s and 70s of apartments. And these developers that come in and purchase properties and do renovations and specialize in this tax credit financing look at properties of about that era, because that seems to be when they need to be purchased, renovated. And some of the challenges are that HUD provides a 30-year contract to that developer for if it's project-based Section 8, for Section 8 assistance there, and it's really difficult to stop that process. It's a 30-year contract. It's very hard to stop it without being able to demonstrate we don't need that housing in Newport News. One of the other things that developers do is they look at the demographics. And so Newport News has been attractive in this way because our demographics show that we do have a considerable number of people who do qualify for tax credit housing, which, as I said, may not necessarily be subsidized, but there are income restrictions that it could be as much as 60% of the median for Newport News. The difference with traditional public housing is that HUD requires us to, for every admission, 75% of everybody admitted into public housing, their income has to be less than 30% of median. So some of the rules about public housing sort of make it a systemic problem because we have to concentrate people, at least 75% when they enter have to be less than 30% of median. For family 4, that's just a little bit over $25,000. So part of the issues and concerns we have, there was a time with public housing where you could even do income mixing in public housing, and that people could make up to 80% of median, which is a fairly significant amount of money to live there, but that's just not the case anymore. So some of the concerns that we have is just the rules that the federal government places on us, because their goal is to assist those who need it the most, and
right.
That's a laudable goal. But the end result is that we end up concentrating a lot of people in one small area.
Well, could you talk about Section 8 and vouchers? People don't understand what those concepts may be as well.
There are two different kinds of Section 8 assistance. One is a voucher that is given to a family, and that family can take that voucher and move anywhere. Actually, they can move anywhere in the United States. They don't have to keep it here in Newport News. But it has to be in an apartment or a house that rents at a fair market value. And the Housing Authority goes in and inspects it and makes sure that it meets certain criteria. But then there are also agreements that HUD has with developers, and they project-base Section 8. So every apartment in that complex has a subsidy attached to it. A family has to qualify for it. They move there, but if they ever decide to move out, that subsidy doesn't go with them like a voucher does. A voucher can be taken anywhere.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about communities in general. My belief is that a sustainable, healthy community is one that is not monolithic or homogeneous. You have black, white, Republican, Democrat, different educational standards. It's a mixed community, and I've lived in communities like that. One that stands out in my mind is Columbia, Maryland, where it's a planned community, and you would have smaller apartments next to a $500,000 home. It was a very blended community, a village-oriented community. I believe Newport News would be healthy in that sense of having that. What are some of the challenges you see as planning director in trying to promote that based on the history of how racially Newport News developed and where we are now with a longer city of achieving a goal like that? Is that something reasonable for Newport News to accomplish?
I think it's reasonable. As a matter of fact, Newport News was developed originally similarly to that, because the traditional neighborhood, you had a mix of incomes and mixes of people together. You know, in Newport News was segregated. It was in the South, but other than that, when it came to incomes, you had a mix of incomes. The issue today has a lot to do with zoning. You have strict single family, you have strict multiple family, and so it's all going to be placed in separate areas, and you can't intermix the two. There are certain things you can do moving forward if you want to do something similar to that, such as some of the new development that we have, like Huntington Point. Huntington Point would be a mix, but I think the focus with Huntington Point was really more affordable housing. But you would have your smaller units. You'd have different types of housing units. You'd have quads, duplexes, townhouses, apartments, and you would have a mix of single family. And if it's large enough, you could have your large single family in there, so you could have more expensive housing mixed with lower priced housing. And that's how you would develop that mix of incomes in a neighborhood today.
Lee, in a neighborhood like that, would Achievable Dreams still be as successful or even more so?
Absolutely. I definitely think it would be as successful because it really is about the type of education. And when you're looking at bringing a holistic approach to education, making sure that you're not just educating the children academically, but also social and emotionally, that's a blend that all children can benefit from. You know, so I think that the mix would also bring different exposures and a different set of expectations for all children to strive for. You know, it would be something that all families and children would be able to learn from their own individual experiences that they bring to the table and blending that all together. It's really the best of the education and neighborhood together.
I'll use myself as an example. I was brought up in a neighborhood, well, Marshall Ridley, when I was a kid, I lived right next to it, was predominantly white. Not Marshall Courts, okay, on Marshall Avenue. Went to segregated schools. So my first exposure to anyone that didn't look like me was probably when I got to college or in the Army. My problem with us still having these types of neighborhoods is right now in Newport News, the majority of the public housing in that area is predominantly black. And I'm concerned both educationally and planning of kids who don't get to intermingle other than maybe in school, depending upon if they go to a neighborhood school or not, being able to see various different cultures and races. So one of the challenges we have with the C&I grant, which is supposed to be transformational, is to have people of all colors, of all religions, of all whatever, to be able to want to live in that neighborhood. I think that's what we're trying to establish, such that anywhere in this city, people would want to live there. Statistically, Chief, I know we're trying to accomplish that as well. And the problems that we're having as far as crime, would you say that in that type of neighborhood we would have less crime, or would that be an easier job for you?
It would be tremendously easier. I look at it also from a business model. When I look at the police department, I don't want a department that just has, on one shift, has brand new officers. They experience the same, and all they have to pull from is experience from each other. They've all just started. An ideal shift or an ideal platoon is officers who've been here 5 or 6 years, officers who've been here 20 years, and brand new officers. One brings more energy, one brings more experience, one brings a median, and you learn from each other. I think it's the same thing in that community. In any community that is diverse, you kind of police yourselves. It's not all one issue, and I think it erases some stigmatism of, well, we know what happens there, we know who lives there, we know what goes on in those communities. That's one of the most beautiful parts of the city there on the waterfront. And as we expand, and a diverse community brings all kinds of opportunities. I think it requires less of a response, and I think a community like that is healthy and balanced, diverse, I think they learn from each other. Everybody brings something to the table, and I think that creates a bigger, hey, we're all in this together, as opposed to, you know, this is the area where people have to go if we're struggling financially or issues. And I think that not only creates a stigmatism for those who live there, but those who live in those surrounding areas and those officers at times that police those communities. So I think the more diverse we can have, I think it makes a better balance, a better, healthier neighborhood, a better, healthy community. It would be a tremendous benefit, you know, to disperse and intermingle, and that we're all facing challenges and have opportunities to learn from each other.
Well, I thank you all for your comments. You know, I think we can generally say that nowhere in the world has concentration of poverty been successful. And I want people to understand what we've been challenged with HUD and what we've been blessed with the CNI grant, to be able to transform a community, but yet we have institutions and rules and regulations that perpetuate doing the same thing the same way. And those two bumping into each other, the challenges we're having. And what I also want the public to understand is that as we challenge this process, which we're planning to do with HUD, to try and see if we can do more of that neighborhood, which I think we all think is idealistic, that we're not trying to punish or hurt in the community, but to make it a more healthier community that's going to benefit our whole city. So we hope you understand that. We look forward to having further discussions about that. We ask that you stay in communication with us on those topics that we're talking about, and understand that Newport News is a place where everybody wants to live, and we're trying to just make it a better place. So thank you for your attention today, and we appreciate it.